Well, welcome everybody to another edition of our Summer Intern Spotlight here with the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens. Really excited to be here for another episode. I'm your host, Zach Ragoni, our policy director here at the organization, and I'm here with our summer interns.
Hi, I'm Cassidy.
Hi, I'm David.
Hi, I'm Maryam.
So let's dive right in. Last week, we talked about some of the structural barriers that were facing people returning back into society. But today we're going to look more at a societal barrier, and that's specifically talking about stigma. But before we come to that, I actually want to touch a little bit on something the interns have been working on throughout their time here, and that's their work on our social media platforms. And I want to actually take this opportunity to really commend them and give them a few claps, give them the roses here, because we've had so many wonderful comments from clients, from partners, from even council member staff about how well our social media has been going the past month or so, and all credit goes to these interns for doing that. So I want to jump right in with that, kind of asking, what has it been like trying to create social media content that is informative about the organization and what we're doing, but also engaging enough to capture people's attention? Because you guys definitely seem to have been getting eyeballs on our social media.
I'd say it's not that hard because all I've done up to this point is scroll on social media. So I feel like we're all pretty in the know of the trends just naturally. I would say trying to find appropriate sounds and stuff like that for the content is a little tricky because there's a lot of profanity in popular songs and stuff like that. But besides that, it's been really fun and I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I'd say pretty similar. I think my background, and I'd say all of our backgrounds have prepared us to take on the role of managing the organization's social media platforms. But I think definitely finding appropriate ways to use popular trends and make it make sense in terms of reentry.
Yeah.
And even in terms of from sounds to changing, tweaking a concept just slightly to make it make more sense to promote some event that we have going on, and et cetera.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a bit of a learning experience for me because even though I'm a doom scroller like David and Maryam, I've never been much to post myself on social media very much, aside from just a couple of pictures of friends and family on Instagram. So participating in different TikTok trends has definitely been a bit of an experience for me. But being able to promote our organization in a very fun and lighthearted way while still touching on important issues, I think is very interesting.
So did any of you have a specific social media post or video that you did that really jumps out as kind of your favorite one that you did while you were here?
I just love the TikToks. They're just fun. Sometimes it's annoying to have to be in it because sometimes it catches you at an angle that you don't like. But besides that, I think it's really fun.
Yeah, I'd say the first TikTok we did when we were promoting the book club restarting and coming back, that was my first day here, I think, or second day. But I just hadn't made TikTok since high school, running social media in high school for different clubs and stuff. So I hadn't been in a TikTok for an organization in a while, besides my friends making me a part of their just personal TikToks. So it was just exciting to get back in the swing of things and that kind of mindset when it comes to making TikToks for an organization. It's a different vibe.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite ones was one of the first legacy posts we made. We made one to the crazy frog sound. And it was just a really fun TikTok to film because I had no idea what was happening when Maryam started filming. She just kind of started running around the office, and I was just standing there dumbfounded, what is happening right now? And it just became this really funny video that promoted our legacy program very well, and I just thought it was so much fun to film.
No, that was excellent. I very much enjoyed your all's one from our Reentry Ready event, our close event. It was always a entertaining one, but I do love the way that you guys kind of use that fun and creativity to bring eyes to our social media for them to then be able to see some of the more informational content that's on there.
I also feel like that's how we became closer with you because, you were willing to be in our TikToks, which was really exciting. And so I remember the first time we really hung out with you was when we made the poll TikTok, like the voting TikTok. And it was just so much fun because we hadn't really known you that well. And then we made the TikTok and we are like, oh, this guy's chill. Like, we like this guy.
You got to jump in sometimes.
Yeah.
So transitioning away from the social media, though we will touch back on it, let's go to this topic of stigma. And I want to throw it out there, like, when you hear that word stigma as it relates to people that are returning from incarceration and going through this process, like, what does that word mean to you? What does it kind of conjure up in your head?
I think of like negative stereotypes, and in terms of returning citizens, how the public doesn't see them in like a great light, and how they just naturally assume that just because someone was incarcerated, like they're a terrible human being, which is not true at all.
Yeah, I agree. Just like predisposed notions or like negative connotations about people coming back from incarceration and having just like preformed ideas about them and kind of generalizing all of them to be a specific individual or have like specific characteristics about their personalities that just aren't true.
Yeah, mine, like, what comes to mind for me is very similar to both David and Maryam. It's just like stereotyping, prejudice, just like what comes to mind when you think of a certain group, but often like negatively. And it's often very untrue because like you'll use terminology that is very offensive towards returning citizens, like ex-con, like convicts, felon, like just things that are putting the label before the person. And with the branding of like returning citizens, we're trying to get away from that. But I think stigma kind of brings out the worst side of that, even though it's not truly that. Like, we're reducing people to their worst moments when that's just not the reality.
And when we're talking about stigma, I mean, there's always the very obvious things in terms of, people making comments about an individual, saying things like ex-con and stuff like that. But do you think like that there's a more subtle version of stigma in terms of just that might not be so clear and obvious, but still impacts things?
I definitely think so. I think it's even just with like employers not wanting to hire because, they have a record without even looking into like the circumstances behind why they have a record. Or it could just be, I found out that my friend's boyfriend is a returning citizen. I don't think he's a safe person to be around. Just like those like social things where you're just like immediately making a snap judgment about someone without understanding their story, what circumstances put them in that type of situation to make that choice.
No, absolutely. And do you think when we talk about stigma, because we also have talked about as an organization different things, that accountability does matter, and we will always talk about restorative justice, and one of the key parts of that is the ability to take accountability, but also then restore someone back to the community. So what do you think the difference is between holding someone accountable, but not necessarily permanently defining them by what happened in the past? Or how do you do that? How do you navigate that struggle?
I mean, I think it just comes down to believing that people can change and, having that ideology like at the forefront of your mind when talking to someone who's a returning citizen or maybe has family members that are returning citizens. And, like you said, the organization isn't dismissing, someone's past or maybe things that they have done. It's more about, okay, like an individual did this. Now, what steps are in place to take accountability and then go past that and, give back to the community or continue their life or things like that. Because I remember Cassidy always quotes this guy from the book, and he's like, you're better than
Brian Stevenson.
Yeah, Brian Stevenson. Like, you're better than your, worst decision?
You're more than the worst thing you've ever done.
Yeah, you're more than the worst thing you've ever done. And I think, just having at the forefront of your mind that if I think but baseline, I think it goes back to if you think that someone can change. And then if you think that someone can change, then I think you're able to recognize, when someone has taken accountability for something and has steps in place to, tangibly do something about it. Now we're changing the way that people think.
No, absolutely. So talking about some of those perceptions, let's kind of dive into where some of those perceptions might come from. Like, where do you think a lot of people or most people tend to develop the impressions that they have of people who have been incarcerated?
I think publicity happens is a big reason why some people have those perceptions of those who've been incarcerated. I think of trials that are on the news, the decision and things like that, or criminal trials, and it's it was a crazy crime that was committed, and then you kind of associate all criminals with criminal charges, even though not everybody's incarcerated just because they committed a felony, or not everybody's incarcerated just because they may have committed murder. I think sometimes people associate the entire group of returning citizens in that same vein.
It's kind of all crime is the same. It's just this giant umbrella of crime.
Yeah.
Okay. What about things you were just talking about news being a large driver, but what about things like television or movies, things like that, the way that things are presented? Do you think that has a large hand in it, or do you think people generally do a good job of separating kind of the entertainment from reality?
I feel like television and movies and that type of media definitely plays a large role, because even if you just break it down to just representation, the way a group is represented in that form of media often perpetuates different stereotypes, no matter whether or not they're positive or negative. And so I think it just kind of boils down to that. So when you're representing returning citizens in that type of media, but you're making them seem like these horrifying villains that only commit crimes because they want to and because they're just bad people, then people are going to start to follow that stereotype and just think, oh, okay, they're bad people, they're villains, and they're not going to think of the circumstances that put them there.
Yeah. I think less so about the media. I feel like we're taught from a super young age to kind of isolate people who make mistakes and shun them in a way. I feel like it goes down to sending someone to timeout or putting their desk outside. It's very isolationist. Isolate them from the rest. We always talk about that saying where it's one bad apple in the bunch. So I feel like it kind of goes down. I feel like that could play a role in it, in how you kind of condition your mind from such a young age to associate isolating people with when they do bad things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I one of the things I'd want to touch on is kind of what gets the attention. And I think one of the interesting things I'll compare it to is, I know the three of you all have connections to Florida in some way. And a common trope in media and things is that Florida man notion. Those crazy stories of Florida man found riding a tractor through the middle of a Walmart, or wrestling a gator, those type of things, to where that gets all the attention for Florida. Whereas you don't see a lot of good stories of Florida man does this wonderful, helpful thing or does this charitable thing. And I feel like it's very similar with returning citizens in this population what gets the more attention? The people who end up having issues and going back, or the people that come out and do great things?
Yeah, I just remember when I was I want to say we were in elementary school or middle school, and that article had come out about that guy who had done Flocka. Do you guys remember Flocka, the drug? Yes. And he had done Flocka, and he bit someone's face off.
Yeah.
At a bus stop in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was crazy.
And I remember when we heard that, we were like, what? And then it was Flocka man. It was Florida man, but now it was Flocka man. Yeah, it was crazy.
And to the outside, that becomes what Florida people are doing.
Yeah,
they're all crazy.
There's definitely a brand associated with Florida now that people do crazy stuff.
Yeah. And so it's kind of that same thing is
Yeah.
what gets the attention creates the narrative and creates then stigma. So with that in mind then, I mean, it seems that stories ultimately matters. And do you think, what tends to be more influential in changing stigma, do you think? Stories or data?
I mean, it should in reality be data, but I think it is just stories, like hearing personal lived experience. It should be the statistics showing how discriminatory our system is, but instead people like to listen to a personal account, especially if that account is coming from a white person, unfortunately. In our media, we like to sideline voices of people of color, and like, for example, if a white woman goes missing, that is national news, it's everywhere, but if a black woman goes missing, it's barely a footnote. And that's like what is disgusting about our media is it is not representative. It just represents the voices that they think should be heard.
No, that's a fantastic point.
I think also it depends what you're trying to get across. I think there's certain instances where anecdotal evidence can be way more beneficiary to people digesting information. I think in like an academic or educational setting, data definitely gets the point across. But, there are groups of people in America who, don't have access to those kinds of things, or, we are seeing a decline in our literacy rates across America, things like that, where, they may not be able to always interpret the data or read the data. So I think anecdotal stories can be, equally as beneficial as data. And also, as we talked about, like the rise of media and publicization of things, anecdotal evidence is a lot easier to, as clickbait.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the stories that are spoken about inside people's homes. I think no matter what data or what stories are being pushed out, whatever you're talking about at your kitchen table, I think you're gonna almost run with that kind of mindset of how you view reentry and returning citizens. And if there's not a positive light on reentry within your home and within your family, I think most of the time you're gonna kind of continue that mindset, and almost the stigma is always gonna exist no matter if you try to if you try to mitigate it. I think it's almost it takes more work. It's not gonna just be, oh, I just saw the story, I think this way, but you're always gonna have that inkling of something you heard when you were younger, I feel like.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think all of us here, we've had family members and just influential people in our lives, which shape the way we think about reentry before we even got here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why we think about returning citizens in more of a positive light, but that I think of other people who may not have had those same experiences, and it may affect the stigma that they have towards reentry.
Absolutely. And something Cassidy said jumped out at me in terms of the differences that certain stories or certain things can get. And it makes me think of something that is a common point that I like to come back to as it relates to this stuff, kind of some hard questions. Honestly, if I had my own podcast, I think it'd be hard questions. It's taking things and going, this gives us what we want, but do we actually want it? Because it says something different. So when we're talking about stigma, what about situations that get more attention that might change the stigma in a good way, and yet the people in it might not be the ones you want to focus on? So, for instance, you saw a lot of conversation following the January 6th stuff and the things surrounding the Trump administration, some of the people that went in, and all of a sudden you saw a lot of people in the country that normally were very hesitant to talk about misuse of police, mistreatment of people that have gone through jail, all of a sudden becoming more open to talking about that, thinking about that, reconsidering, hey, is there something worth looking at to look at someone beyond just what their charge is? And yet, the things that were going on typically were stuff that people in the reform community were not really big fans of. So when you have a news story like that that is focused on people that you might not necessarily agree with or even like, but is moving that in a way that would actually reduce the stigma, is that a good thing or not? Is there some benefit to that because of the stigma being removed?
I think, yeah. I know that might be controversial. And regardless of like what people think about like January 6th and stuff like that, I think you can't have one without the other. And so I don't think you can really make an argument about something and then, not support it when the alternate thing happens. Like, not alternate, but something in like a similar vein. But
Right.
again, like the context or the background is not what you believe in. Like, the roots are not what you believe in. But then, they can't be mutually exclusive. I think it goes to say the same thing about how, we saw like the issue with Trump v. Casa and the executive orders. Like, sure, like, if you're more left-leaning, which as we can, acknowledge, Rand Truick is definitely more liberal, more left-leaning, you don't entirely agree with the reasoning why executive orders were upheld in this scenario. Like, yeah, it was having to do with like the baseline of birthright citizenship. However, you can look in the past and historically there has been, executive orders that have been passed that haven't like always succeeded because of, like things that like judges have passed and like an overstep of, judicial reach and things like that. So if you look at it in like a different light, like while it may not be upheld for a reason that you support, like in the long term, like in the long run, it is going to be beneficial like to your party. And I think that's the same thing with, the arguments surrounding, the questioning like and resentencing the January 6th rioters. It opens up the conversation and allows the argument of, okay, now we've done it for this group of people. We've acknowledged that it's possible. We've acknowledged that, we're willing to do this. Now let's look at this other group of people who we've been trying to fight for forever, because in America, hopefully we upheld that in
Strive for the equality.
Yes,
there.
equality and justice and freedom.
No, that's it's always an interesting thing, and sometimes we have to talk about the controversial things because, like, specific to that in D.C., one of the odd things is we've been talking about the problems with the D.C. jail for years and years and years and years, and some of the most significant attention and focus on it in recent years was when those January 6 people were in there, and it saw some action taken. And it was one of those, on one hand, it was going, hey, black and brown people have been suffering through this horrible jail for decades, and nothing was done, and that's wrong, and calling that out. And on the flip side, everybody in that jail benefited to some extent because of the additional attention that was paid to it because of that. And so it's always an interesting thing as it relates to stigma with that. And I think there's not necessarily a right answer, but something to be thinking about. And when we're talking about stigma, like what is that impact? And because it's not just, I think sometimes when people hear stigma, they're thinking, oh, someone's feelings hurt, someone got called, ex-con, and they're going to feel upset. But what's the actual like tangible impact that stigma can have on someone that's returning?
Well, it could cause so many different barriers against that person who's trying to get back to normalcy and re-enter society. Because when you have that stigma surrounding you, the moment you apply for a job, they're going to discard your resume because it says that you have a record. They're not going to consider you. When you're applying for an apartment, same thing. They're going to say, oh, they could be dangerous. We don't want them in our complex. When you're trying to get a loan for something, you're denied. You can't get off your feet. When you're trying to get a car, it just goes and goes and goes, no matter what it is. And so it just kind of keeps pushing you back. And the more you get denied, the more hopeless you feel. And the biggest thing you need when you're trying to get yourself off your feet is hope for the future, and knowing that I can do this, I can get myself off the ground, I can get myself working, I can get myself back to normal. But if you're constantly being pushed down and told, no, you can't do this, you can't do that because of your past, then you're just going to give up. And that's the worst thing you can do for someone trying to get off their feet again.
Absolutely. And in want to jump on that in terms of that hope and fear, because I think it's. Do you think that society tends to respond more from fear of what someone might do, what might occur because of their past and what that thought of them, or do you think that hope is more what society focuses on in terms of hope for what that person can become, what can go forward with them?
It's definitely fear. If in terms of like those barriers that Cassidy was speaking of, there's certain things you can't do if like you have a criminal background. Sometimes like they won't let you work around children because of that fear that you're going to do something to harm the children, even if you've been out of prison for 10 plus years and haven't like reoffended since. And I think in that similar vein, people often fear drives what happens and the barriers that returning citizens do have.
Yeah, I agree with David. All I was going to add is I was going to kind of circle it back to social media just a little bit.
Absolutely.
Is I think the rise in social media has increased our fear levels because, because when you're constantly having so many horrible like statistics, news stories, killings in the media, like so many different negative things constantly thrown at you, it makes you so fearful of what's to come. It makes you fear for the future. It makes you say, oh, our environment's dying. Like, what are we going to do? Like, you're constantly afraid and you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something bad to happen again and again and again. And so I think it just kind of allows that fear to be perpetuated in every realm, like David was talking about, how it invades your job opportunities. It invades everything because once you're fearful, that's all you can think about is that long-standing fear.
Yeah, the hyper exposure to everything in our generation is definitely working against us. I think you see so many times on social media like these rare cases of things happening in society, and of course your brain can't regulate those emotions because everything is happening so fast and you're constantly scrolling, and so it puts you in this weird position where your brain knows that, this is a possibility because you've seen it. However, it can't distinguish the fact that that's probably not going to happen to you. So it is just like this false reality that your brain is playing out in your head. And yeah, just like what David and Cassidy said, it's definitely not helpful.
So when talking about that, do you think there is a certain level of caution that is reasonable or understandable as it relates to interacting with those that are coming back, and like a point where maybe that caution becomes permanent judgment or over the top, and to kind of connect it, since it was already Florida centric, that difference of hurricane coming in, there's some ways to be cautious about it and that probably are reasonable, and then people panic. Or for all of those here in the DMV area, when a snowstorm's coming in, hey, having a shovel and maybe some ice and maybe a little bit of food is reasonable caution. Having 2 tons of toilet paper, about a cow's worth of milk, probably not so much, but that's what people kind of panic for. So do you think there is that level of reasonable caution that's okay?
I think it depends on each circumstance. Like, it has to be kind of on a case-by-case basis because you're not going to treat someone who committed mass murder the same as someone who committed tax fraud.
Right.
Like, you're not going to have that same level of caution. Like, it definitely depends on the offense. But also, I think time has a lot to do with it, because if someone committed a violent crime and they just got out like a month ago, you might be a little bit more weary. But if they committed a crime a decade ago, I feel like unless they've reoffended, that fear is unjustified at that point.
And I think we should use a similar mindset to like weather events. I think sometimes they think of Floridians when it comes to a hurricane and like, oh, my family's been here for 5 generations. Like, we don't care. But I think what gets lost is that we still do take steps to prepare. Like, we get sandbags and put them in front of our doors. We may even put up the shutters if like it's a dangerous storm coming. And I think like Cassidy was saying, like, you shouldn't treat all situations the same, but there definitely still is like a level of caution that you should take for yourself.
Absolutely.
In the sense of overreach, I think it's important to have some introspection when interacting with individuals returning from society, and to make sure that you're not being too harsh about your judgments, but still, remaining cautious. I think it's just important to look within and recognize, okay, what am I saying? What am I thinking? What is my body language? How much do I know about this person? Is that reasonable? Is it not? What can I do to adjust? Things like that.
No, that all makes sense, and it is that first 90 days they always say is the most difficult part for time for someone that's returning. You're still in the most institutional mindset. You're at the most chaotic of situations when you're first coming out, and so caution doesn't always have to be necessarily negative. Caution can be that, hey, I know this person's just coming out, and I want to be there to give them support during this time because I know it's going to be the point where it's most needed. But to that point of time, a lot of studies have ended up showing that, at 5 to 7 years out from leaving incarceration, if the person has not reoffended, statistically, they're no more likely to commit another crime than the average person. And so any level of caution towards them beyond what you would give any other person just is unreasonable in terms of actual facts. But as we talked about, sometimes stories matter more than facts in terms of the people.
And I mean, at that point, it just kind of shows that you're paranoid, because if after like 5 to 7 years they haven't reoffended, they're just like the rest of us kind of at that point. Like, are you going to be fearful of every single person you walk past? If so, that's a problem that you need to reevaluate. Like, you need to do some personal introspection, because that means you're afraid of everything. Like, you're a bit too paranoid at that point.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the social media thing, is that I feel like not only does it spread fear in one avenue, I think it spreads fear amongst everything. I think people are so scared now about everything.
The algorithm kind of promotes fear because that's what gets clicks.
And also, I feel like it's kind of a cycle, because studies have shown like your dopamine releases, like your dopamine sensors and your serotonin sensors when you're scrolling are like at an all-time high. And so that obviously provides or mirrors like a safe space, whether it actually is or not, it's up to interpretation, but it mirrors a safe space. And so that's comfortable. And so obviously if you're doom scrolling and everything on your page is making you fear the outside and you find comfort in scrolling, then, you're going to keep scrolling. You're going to, expose yourself less to, external like experiences and opportunities, because obviously like fear reigns. And yeah, it's interesting how
so let's jump off that then in that case, what are some ways that we could leverage and use social media then to fight back against the stigma, to fight back against some of that fear, to try to alter things?
I think sharing positive stories, that's one thing at the National Reentry Network that we have done in terms of our Black Table Talk magazine. Every year or every magazine that has been released, they do a interview with the returning citizen talking about the things they have done since returning back to society, how that the challenges they have faced and the good things that they've been up to since.
Yeah, and I think some of the stuff you guys have been doing in terms of trying to find ways to leverage what is currently trending, what is currently common, to draw eyes to then get them to see some of the more either heart or head kind of information on there, I think is one of those great ways to do it, where you gotta get the eyeballs on and get them to stop the doom scrolling to then look at the more serious things.
Yeah, I think it's also like just what David was saying, like all of that is just humanizing them. And I think once you humanize an individual, it's a lot easier to understand what they're saying, and be empathetic towards their situation. Also, like back towards the social media thing, I like what we do when we, do kind of like the silly trends and things like that, because, reentry work and work regarding returning citizens, is serious. And I feel like can often have like a more, narrow light. Like it can be very, very much like this was, like sad and, important and serious. And I think, the fun and playful TikToks that we make kind of lifts that vibe off of them. And I feel like it just normalizes the issue, because, you see all these statistics coming out where it's like, 1 in 7 people in the U.S., have been to jail or prison. And, it's way more common than you think, and it's not, so black and white. Like, it can be, like red and orange and blue and green and yellow and purple. And, yeah, just, like, being able to be playful with it and open conversations to it and have people interact with it and, be like, yeah, you know what, this is a cool program. Like, are the circumstances that led this individual to take part in this program sad and maybe negative? Sure. But that doesn't have to be the line of thought forever. It can be, yeah, they participate in stupid TikTok trends.
So moving forward on things, outside of, say, social media type stuff, what's one thing that you think individuals or communities or businesses could do on their own to help reduce stigma towards this population?
I think part of it is changing the language around it and the way you approach this community, because returning citizens have such a negative connotation surrounding them already. And so I think being a business that hires returning citizens, that's a great step. Being someone who, like, if your company has social media, give that person a spotlight. Talk about, like, how they've moved forward, like, why they're a great employee. Just, like, trying to change the way we think about returning citizens. And also that comes with language. Like, we've talked a lot about this throughout the various podcasts and through our social media posts, just using respectful language, putting the label after the person, because you are more than the worst thing you've ever done. Gosh, it's just like habit at this point. It just kind of comes
so
out.
Impactful.
Yes, it literally is just ingrained in my brain at this point. But just, like, recognizing that you are more, and that just being able to recognize that these are people, like Maryam was saying, humanizing people, that is so, so important.
And I think it's also important to, like, volunteer your services or donate the goods you have. I know it was a few days ago, I was looking at something in some grocery store near, like, Southeast DC was, like, donating, like, fresh produce or something one weekend. And I think things like that, it provides not only to the Raintree community, but the community as a whole. And I think it helps limit the stigma in that light as well. It's like you're not just offering it to returning citizens and making them feel bad or, like, for coming out and, like, but it's helping the whole community as a whole. And opportunities like that really help change the perspective that people have.
Yeah, because you're not singling anyone out. You're just acknowledging and helping the whole community.
Yeah.
And that's important.
Yeah, and it's similar, like, I was actually, like, kind of going to touch on both of those things. I think it's super important to reemphasize community. And so if you are, like, a stakeholder in a community and you're a business and, like, a functioning business, to hold those events for people to come out and, like, talk to each other and get to know each other and, closing that social gap and just allowing for conversations to happen in the first place, while also, maybe getting a free haircut or, getting a free button or free food or something like that. I think that concept was introduced to me, like, through CLPM. Like, I'd never really thought about, oh yeah, like, if you are a functioning business, like, do you have any events? Like, when you guys ask them, the businesses, like, oh, do you guys have any events, like, that are free and open to the public? Like, it had never really occurred to me that, that would be so important in playing a role in, building a safe community where everybody's friends and has conversations.
Absolutely. And I think one of the ones I want to throw a suggestion out there as well to some of our listeners in terms of this, because I imagine a lot of those listening are either just as impacted or allies to that kind of movement. And what I would strongly suggest as it relates as a way to combat the stigma is, if you know individuals that haven't really had much interaction with those that have gone through the criminal legal system, find opportunities to connect someone that's had no experience with it with someone that has, in ways that have nothing to do with the criminal legal system. Yeah. If they're both fans of the Commanders, get them together and talking about football. If they like to cook, get them together talking about that, and give that person that's never interacted with someone that's actually gone through the system a chance to see that they're just people. they're just everyday people. And that, I think, is one of the biggest things that can deal with the stigma, because the less we see people as others and more we see them as humans and as people and as neighbors, then the harder it is to really ostracize them. So thank you all for a wonderful podcast and episode here. It was a great discussion. I hope everybody out there listening really enjoyed it. Next week is going to be a little bittersweet. It's going to be our final podcast for the Summer Spotlight series with these interns. So we get to kind of go over the whole ball that we got to experience over the past couple months. So stay tuned next week for that final one as we continue to shine a spotlight on our wonderful interns.